Hello from Big Ten Media Days. My name is Brad LaPlante, and I am here with Ryan O'Blenis and Paul Fanson from Spartans Illustrated. We both, or all three of us this year for the first time, just partook in Michigan State's annual Big Ten appearance, and we have some thoughts. First, Ryan, what do you think? Michigan State coming off of a 5-7 season, black and white, basically night and day from the previous season that they had. What do you think? What were your takeaways? Your expectations going into this season, and how do you think that Michigan State's sort of addressing, those sort of problems?
I think there's a lot of intrigue around the team, right? A lot of mystery. You coming off of that 5-win season with a lot of question marks, right? But what the thing that kind of stands out to me and kind of stood out to me throughout the entire spring, talking to the different players and coaches and stuff, and the media availabilities and things like that, is that this team is very hungry. They have a chip on their shoulder. They have low expectations from the national media, which in a way reminds me of the 2021 season. Obviously, we aren't saying that this team's going to win as many games as they did in 2021, but the general vibe and the feeling, and some of the players talking about that perhaps in 2022 they were too complacent coming off of that success from the 2021 season. Throughout the spring, throughout the summer, going into fall camp next week, this team is just hungry, ready to work, and what they're here to prove people wrong, right? They don't have a lot of expectations, as we talked about, and a lot of national pundits don't know if they'll even make it to 6 games and if they'll miss a bowl game again. So I think that the outside expectations are a lot different than in the building. Mel Tucker talked about this isn't any kind of in-between year, any kind of year for them to lay the foundation. Their goal is to win as many games as possible, just like every other team out here in the country. So that they're going to attempt to do that, and they feel like they have improved depth, and they feel like they're going to surprise some people, and they have that chip on their shoulder, and they're just going to keep working.
Yeah, and I wonder, what it's like to be sometimes in that locker room. What happened, when you're going through a season like 11-2, there's almost this euphoria, right? Obviously for an athlete, you can get better, you can do better, but at least you're winning, right? You're winning games. Whereas when you're 5-7, there is that contrast of we don't know, how good are we? There's a lot more. It's not happy. It's not a happy environment, right? And so that's obviously not great. So Cal Halliday talked about that a little bit too. He was talking about how they want that to change, and I wonder really if there's a reset for that optimism to come back and see how hungry Michigan State really is when they play Central Michigan in Week 1. Paul, I wanted to know, what do you think your takeaways are as far as Michigan State coming in very much an underdog team this year? What are your thoughts on, and how do you think Michigan State's attacking that?
Well, I think the biggest question mark for me coming into this season is, why are things potentially going to be different than they were last year? And I think we got a couple hints to that this year. Some things they can control, some things they can't. Overall, both Coach Tucker and a lot of the players talked about the improved depth on the team. But I think along with that, we have to address the question of injuries from last year. And that was something that, again, came up, I think, both on the podium as well as in the individual table interviews afterwards. Obviously, there were a lot of injuries last year. I personally think that injuries are somewhat of an have an underrated impact in the college game, just because, there are fewer players. Not everybody's NFL talent, so if you lose a couple guys, it can have a fairly large impact. And I think that was exactly the case, especially on defense last year. So odds are that will be better this year, because it's hard to be as bad as they were last year. And if so, I think there is some reason to be optimistic for the team next year.
It is funny, though. We said that last year, right? I remember when, the biggest question mark for Michigan State in 2021 was the defense. Is it sustainable to give up hundreds and hundreds of rushing yards? Not rushing yards, sorry, passing yards. is that sustainable? Because the defense, with as bad as it's been, I mean, their offense made up for it in 2021. You didn't see that in 2022. So I really wonder if if the defense has changed, if Michigan State can actually sort of turn towards a more optimistic season, or see if that levels out. Because to me it seemed like they overperformed maybe in 2021 and then underperformed in 2022. So it is interesting to see the dynamic of the dynamic shift, right? Your highs are really high and your lows being so low. So it's interesting. And a couple things I wanted to discuss too. Obviously the three key points right now. First being the quarterback battle, the elephant in the room, right? So you have Peyton Thorne transfer out from Michigan State to Auburn. Okay, so he's gone. Your quarterback for the last 2 years has exited, and now you have Caden Hauser came in as a freshman. What was that, last season, right? And now you have Sam Levitt, who is a new recruit as a freshman, and then you have obviously Noah Kim is the I don't want to say senior as in physically he's a senior, but he has the seniority in the quarterback room. So what do you think that Michigan State is doing, and how are they approaching this quarterback battle? Because they kind of gave the implication that it's wide open.
Yeah, I don't know if we got a lot of clarity on the quarterback battle today. Certainly, Coach Tucker was asked about that in the morning session, but he was directly asked about only Noah Kim. So he gave some positive comments about Noah Kim. The only other observation I had was that J.D. Duplain in the afternoon, when asked about the quarterbacks, Kim was the first quarterback that came out of his mouth. But other than that, there really wasn't a lot of discussion other than them wishing Thorne well in his next adventure. But I think Tucker said more about the quarterback battle.
He did, but at the same time, as you mentioned, we're here at Big Ten Media Days. They're not really going to glean too much right now because, one, they don't know themselves. They have to see how fall camp goes. Obviously they know who performed better during the spring, and then with Peyton Thorne transferring out, Tucker said he wasn't surprised. Not necessarily that Thorne transferred out, but that one of the quarterbacks transferred out because, back in the day when he coached, they used to be comfortable keeping 3 scholarship quarterbacks. Now their goal is always to have 4 because you never know when somebody might transfer out after the spring. And that's why a lot of the times you see MSU and many other programs try to add a quarterback recruit every year into their class, to make sure that you have that insurance. And I think that he did have some positive things to say about Kim today. He called him a winner. He also said he's like one of the top 20 fastest players on the team. I think he said he had really good arm talent. And later at the podium session, he talked a little bit more about it. I know that he's really high on Caden Hauser's arm talent too, and things like that. And I think that they feel really confident in that one of those 2 players is capable of being the starting quarterback there for Michigan State. I don't think that's necessarily a concern for them, even though it's an unknown to everybody else. Neither has much experience. I think they have 21 passes thrown between them, and 19 of those belong to Kim. So, maybe Kim has the upper hand in terms of being around the program longer. But things that I've heard about Hauser is that he picked up the playbook super quickly. Trey Mosley was talking about Sam Levitt, saying that he's a super self-confident kid. Tucker actually called it a 3-man race for the quarterback with Levitt in there. I think in reality it's obviously between Kim and Hauser, but I think that might say a lot about Levitt if he's already getting this kind of praise about being self-confident, about being in the mix for the quarterback race. So I think he can do some things in the future. He's a really impressive high school kid. But yeah, I think right now obviously the options are Kim or Hauser, and we'll see how it's gonna shake out during fall camp.
Yeah, it'll be definitely really interesting for sure. Now about the defense and its struggles over the last couple of years, and Mel Tucker's a defensive-minded guy, right? He was a defensive back in college. Now, that might be surprising, right? Defensive guys should, have a hold on the defense. That hasn't really gone the right way, especially considering the passing yards that Michigan State has given up. So where do you guys think that Michigan State is at from a defensive side of the ball, and how do you think their approach is going? I know injuries really hampered them last year. They had several guys out, including Slade and others at one point. And so it's hard to say, like, what they're like at their healthiest in time. So what do you think? How do you think Michigan State's approaching that? And what did they have to say today?
I think if you look at the front seven of the team, it's much improved. And Tucker was talking, too, just how much bigger both the offensive and defensive linemen look in the program compared to 2-3 years ago that he's heard comments about that. I think they use the transfer portal to bring in several defensive linemen. He mentioned that Tumise Adelaide is most likely going to play defensive end, but he can also play in obvious passing situations, they might put him inside. And when we talked to him earlier this spring, he said he can play any technique on the defensive line from 0 all the way down to wide 9. So, I think, and then in the middle, they brought in Colorado transfer Jalen Sami, who's, listed as like 6'6", 330 pounds, something like that. Tucker was gushing about him at the podium today, saying that, when he hit the portal, people in that Michigan State recruiting office were running in the hallways trying to get to him. So that was the guy they really want to add. They also bring in Jared Jackson, Drake Butler, so they really attack the trenches through the transfer portal. And then in the high school ranks, they brought in 3 really talented defensive ends, Jalen Thompson, Andrew DePape, and Bai Jobe. So, and then at the linebacker position, you have several guys returning in Cale Halliday, Jacoby Wimman, Aaron Brule. And he was asked about Darius Snow. Tucker was at the podium today, and, obviously he doesn't like to say too much about injuries. He was non-committal about, when Snow would be ready, if he'd be able to participate in fall camp. He said he's had, a really long rehab and a significant injury. So, it'll be interesting to see if Snow, returns at some point. And then in the secondary, I think, is where you have most of the questions on the defense, because there's and that's been the case the last 2 years. Tucker made a joke that's why he hired Jimmy Salgado as cornerbacks coach, because, Tucker tried to coach the cornerbacks himself last year, and he said he made the team worse. They only had 2 interceptions last year. But so in the secondary, you have an interesting mix of youth and an interesting mix of returning players. I think a lot of those 2022 guys like Jaden Mangum, Dylan Tatum, Malik Spencer, Caleb Coley, like those guys are going to have an opportunity to really get a lot of playing time. But then you also have veterans returning like Marquis Lowry, who's spent a lot of time injured, who I think can be an impact player if he's healthy. And Angelo Gross, I think, is best served at the nickel position. And there's a lot of different guys returning who could also still make an impact, and there were a few transfers in the secondary too. So I think overall there's a lot of optimism that the defense will be better this year. We'll see if that's the case in practice, when the time actually comes. But in theory, it looks better. Like I said, especially in the front seven, I think they got a lot bigger. I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on the quarterback, and I think they'll be better at stopping the run.
That's very, very, very optimistic to hear. I mean, even last year, there was this, notion. Michigan State, Mel Tucker were talking about how bad the defensive backs were, and Mel Tucker even said it himself. He's like, "We were last. You can't be worse than that." And this year, there were injuries, obviously, but it seemed worse. It seemed like it got worse, but the pressure felt like it came from the offense not scoring, and if the defense can't keep up, then it's just a lose-lose situation by all means. So we want to talk about next really is how do you think the team's gelling? And, as far as chemistry goes, team bonding's important. It seems like Michigan State has made that a priority to get their football program. I think Mel Tucker was talking about how, it's important for a couple hours after practice or moments after practice, whatever, the players are staying after to, get along with one another. And I think Cal Halliday actually mentioned too when I was sitting there that him and a couple of guys from the team went to a Lugnuts game, right? Lansing Lugnuts, the single A affiliate for the Oakland A's, and they were just hanging out. Like it was a nice respite to get away from that football life, right? And that's obviously very important. So where do you think, what other things did you notice as far as team chemistry goes, bonding, and how can this team really get comfortable with one another, especially when one of your biggest weaknesses is on defense, a place where communication is very important?
Well, as you mentioned, Brad, that topic did come up in several different ways this afternoon, both in Tucker's initial press conference and later. Now, part of that was in the context of another kind of shadow that was, I think, surrounding this event, which is the current situation at Northwestern. Almost every coach in the morning was asked about the hazing situation there. During the podium session, the Northwestern coach was surrounded by more media than Ryan Day was from Ohio State.
There was a lot of Chicago media. A lot of Chicago media here today.
Yes, a lot of Chicago media. And I think that during the morning session, the coach, he almost tried to filibuster himself out of answering questions. He spoke for about 12 minutes and only allowed time for maybe 2 questions, which frankly I don't blame him for.
Right.
And so when Tucker was asked about this, he very clearly said that Michigan State has an anti-hazing policy, and this is something they discussed. And they brought even things like outside consultants in to speak with the team. But then he kind of pivoted to discuss more about how the team chemistry he feels has improved over the year or over the offseason, citing several examples such as what you mentioned. He had mentioned that they'd had organized events such as dodgeball. When we were talking to the players afterwards, there was some discussion about a miniature golf tournament. J.D. Duplain mentioned more than once that he won that over Trey Mosley. Trey's apparently upset about this. But apparently Trey also had a lot of other trophies in his room from some of the off-season activities and team building.